All right, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here and joining this webinar to talk about the Great Start Readiness Program, or GSRP, Curriculum Approval Process Overview. So we are so glad that you were able to join us this afternoon as we provide an overview over this new and updated approval process that the state of Michigan is using to review and approve curricula for use in the GSRP program. By way of introductions, my name is Ben Fulton. I'm a senior consultant at Public Sector Consultants. We'll talk more about our role later on in the presentation. I'm also joined by Richard. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Richard Lauer, and I'm the Director for Preschool and Out-of-School Time Learning at the Department of Education, Office of Great Start.
Thanks. So just to let everyone know, a couple housekeeping items. First, we're recording this afternoon's webinar, so we'd appreciate if everyone would continue to mute their phones to avoid any unexpected disruptions. The presentation materials, including the recorded webinar, will be posted on the MDE site. Closed captioning is available. If needed, you can make that selection in the webinar player. As for questions, we really appreciate if you could type questions into the chat function on the webinar platform, and we will go ahead and answer those questions at the end. So let's go ahead and get started. So first, I think it would be good to give a quick overview of what we're going to cover today on the webinar. We're going to cover the full spectrum of the approval process from submission of curricula to the final posting of approved curricula. First, we will begin with a bit of background about the program and its administration before going into a high-level overview of the major tasks and timelines. Then we'll give a step-by-step rundown of each layer of the process before answering any questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Richard so he can go ahead and get started with some background information.
Thank you, Ben. So to begin with, the Great Start Readiness Program is Michigan's state-funded public preschool program serving low-income 4-year-olds. It is implemented through intermediate school districts across all 83 counties of Michigan, and it is actually provided through a mixed delivery system of school districts, including local education agencies, public school academies, and community-based organizations. Some intermediate school districts also directly run some GSRP programs itself, though they are in the minority. GSRP itself is a nationally recognized model and has achieved 10 out of 10 quality benchmarks on the National Institutes for Early Education Research yearbook of pre-K quality for the nation. And in part, because of our program approach, we promote a comprehensive, actually require a comprehensive, child-focused, constructive curriculum model that really balances child-initiated and adult-guided active learning in the classroom environment. GSRP does require teaching teams because we have a 1-to-8 child ratio. So the lead teacher and associate teacher interact with children to build on their understanding and enhance learning through play and peer-to-peer interaction. Curriculum must align with Michigan's high standards for quality, which are defined as the Michigan State Board of Education's Early Childhood Standards of Quality for Pre-Kindergarten. These were adopted by the State Board of Education in 2013 and are posted on the GSRP website, which is included later on in the presentation. To speak to that, assessing alignment for any curricula. The state does not identify one best curriculum model, but we utilize a rubric to assess any particular curriculum's alignment with 5 major areas as they align to the standards for quality. The 5 areas are valid research, evaluation results, professional development, developmental appropriateness, and alignment with our state standards. The role we play at the Michigan Department of Education is an important role of oversight authority to ensure integrity and fidelity of the GSRP program and ensuring administering the curriculum approval process, which includes designing the process with feedback from the field, updating the curriculum rubric based on the best practices and research that is available to us, and partnering with public sector consultants to facilitate the process and provide administrative support. Ultimately, we will be publishing a list of approved curricula. Now I'll turn it over to Ben to explain public sector's role in this new revised process.
Thanks, Richard. MDE, as Richard mentioned, has partnered with public sector consultants to conduct the GSRP curricula approval process, and we are really excited to be part of this important project. Our role will be to provide administrative and facilitation support to ensure the process runs smoothly and efficiently. For example, we'll be receiving and processing materials from vendors and coordinating components of the review and approval process, which we will discuss in future slides. MDE will continue to oversee, manage, and administer this overall effort, but I don't want anyone to be alarmed if you see communications coming from me or from my colleague, Michelle Richard. So with that, I'll turn it back to Richard so that he can continue to walk us through some of the key tasks, deadlines, and materials.
Okay. So to make it upfront, an important note is that we have designed this process to be conducted every other year. So MDE will accept, review, and approve GSRP curricula every other year, and only curriculum vendors are eligible to submit a curriculum for approval through this process. So the next few slides are overview of the key tasks and deadlines for the key components of the process, and we're going to go into them a little bit deeper subsequent. But to start with, the first one is the submission. We have on here the most important pieces of that submission process. One is the first thing, what does a vendor need to do? If they're interested in having Michigan consider their curriculum for inclusion in the process, submit an intent to submit their curriculum materials for consideration form. This is what the vendor will do by October 5th. You'll recruit, and then what will happen during the time period is that MD will recruit and train new members of a curriculum review committee. We'll go into that a little bit more shortly during the month of October. And the most important date, I would say, on the slide is October 23rd, the drop-dead deadline for submitting materials for this round of consideration by the vendor. Next phase of the process is the review process. This is ultimately where the materials initially will be screened for to ensure completeness of submission. If there are any missing materials that the vendor may have inadvertently omitted in their submission, there is a period that the vendor will be notified for a second chance to be able to ensure a complete submission so that they have an opportunity to be included in this approval process cycle. Then MD, in partnership with the public sector consultants, will ensure that the curriculum review committee will have the materials to review, and then the process of review will occur. Finally, the major third phase of the process is actually the review and possible, if needed, appeal portion. The curriculum review committee will assess all materials against the rubric that the Department of Education has created based on the standards, and the results of the Curriculum Review Committee will be communicated to the department. The department will inform vendors of the decision. At that point in time, you'll see that will happen in January. At that point in time, vendors will be allowed to submit an intent to appeal if they are not happy with the decision of the Curriculum Review Committee. MD will also, for the sake of the field in Michigan of providers, publish an initial list of the approved curricula while any appeal process is working its way out. So the important documents, that's the next piece to this process. There is a hyperlink on the webinar documents, but the documents are available on the GSRP website at MDE. So the short link is for, you can hyperlink here, but it is www.michigan.gov/GSRP. After the parent section, the next section is dedicated to the curriculum approval process. You'll find all documents at that point on the website. You will find a memo from our Deputy Superintendent announcing this process, the full approval process overview, as well as the criteria, which I went over the 5 main components. And ultimately, there is a report about how this process has been informed by the field. The forms you will find are the intent to submit. That is a form that you will have to download to submit. The actual rubric based on the standards that you will need to fill out, and an application checklist, which is just an aid to help you ensure that you submit a full package of materials for review. Next is the submission process. I'm going to go into more detail at this point in time for that phase. So the first step, completing the intent to submit form. Vendors, you should signal your interest in submitting a curriculum for approval by completing the intent to submit form and sending it to MDE via email. This step helps the department determine how many requests will be submitted and ensures that enough reviewers are put in place and are prepared for the volume of requests. You may email the completed form to myself, Richard Lauer, at the email address on the slide. My last name, L-O-W-E-R, first initial, R, @michigan.gov. The original intent to submit form had a due date of Friday, the 28th, but given that we delayed this webinar by 1 week, we extended a new deadline to October 5th. So that's why it's indicating new deadline. Step 2 is submitting the actual required materials. Again, this is the most important deadline, I would stress. And so vendors must mail 4 full sets of their curriculum materials, again, to public sector consultants. You'll see to Ben Fulton, who is my co-presenter on this webinar, care of public sector consultants. These 4 sets will be distributed to the reviewers on the Curriculum Review Committee. And so the department created a checklist, as I indicated, that is posted on the website to ensure that you include every piece that we require so that each reviewer has all the pertinent information needed to be able to fully assess the curriculum against the standards and has a full, fair, and robust chance at being accepted for approval. Public sector consultants on behalf of the department will review the submissions upon receipt and ensure all the materials are complete upon receipt. If not, you'll be contacted of any missing materials, as well as any completed forms asked for to be received electronically. And that gets to step 2. The vendor must also complete the curriculum alignment rubric. This is probably the most important document, electronic document, to submit along with the materials. The curriculum alignment rubric is how you explain how your curriculum meets Michigan's requirements, meaning the early childhood standards of quality for pre-kindergarten. You are to fill out this document and email the completed form to Ben Fulton at the email address on the screen. Important to note that the documents on the website are a fillable PDF. So both, you'll see screenshots here of the rubric and the document, and a more detailed document have blue highlights indicating that they are fully fillable forms to ease your ability to fill them out and email them. At this point, I will turn it over to Ben to talk about PSC's role in the review and approval process.
Thanks, Richard. So now that we've covered the curriculum submission process, let's talk about the review and approval portion of the process. So that begins with the Curriculum Review Committee, which you're going to refer to throughout this presentation as the CRC, which will review and score proposals and is responsible for ensuring a fair and thorough review. This committee includes a range of early childhood experts representing a diverse set of perspectives. Members of this committee will include GSRP providers, early learning and education experts, higher education professionals, K-3 educators, and MDE staff. So the CRC, their charge is to review, score, and approve GSRP curricula using the preschool curriculum model evaluation rubric that Richard just described to assess a curriculum's alignment with the 5 major elements of effective and quality curriculum design. I won't go into too much detail here because Richard is going to describe that rubric and its components in more detail, but they are valid research, evaluation results, professional development, developmental appropriateness, and alignment with state standards. So, Richard, I'll turn it back to you so that, oh, sorry, we skipped one slide there. Sorry. Little heavy on the button there. So then the last piece before I turn it over to Richard is the CRC's member selection process. The department is committed to identifying highly qualified individuals to serve on the CRC, and it will receive recommendations for these members, and individuals can either submit themselves for recommendations or recommend a colleague. Those chosen to be on the CRC must be able to demonstrate that they have represent one or more of the perspectives that were mentioned earlier, demonstrate a strong background in early learning and development, being willing to commit to 3 years of service to the CRC, and complete a conflict of interest form. Ultimately, the Deputy Superintendent of P20 Systems and Student Transitions will then appoint members from this pool of recommended candidates to represent each perspective mentioned earlier. So now I will turn it over to Richard, I apologize for that, to discuss the rubric.
So the preschool curriculum rubric was developed, as I mentioned, by the department based on a national scan of roughly 13 states, processes, and products related to curricula rubrics. The 5 main areas that stood out related to quality of any particular curricula review process were valid research, evaluation results, professional development, developmental appropriateness, and alignment with state standards. Almost every state in the country at this point has state standards for early childhood, and most are similar in nature. To speak to valid research, I just wanted to explain what the criterion really means. The valid research piece means your curriculum model is going to be grounded in infutable theory and support based on a solid research base. And so that is pretty easy for most curricula that are on the market that are going to be comprehensive in nature. I should note that at this point in time, because I realize that it hasn't been on the slide to begin with. There is a footnote in the approval process overview document that this process is not for supplemental curricula. This process is meant to address the needs of comprehensive curricula, which I have utilized that term already, and I'm bringing it up again now. And the point of that is that a single domain or a two-domain curricula that is developed is not the point of this process. That would only address a small portion of a state comprehensive standards, and it would not meet the charge of this process. So the intent of this process is truly to meet a multi-domain comprehensive process, a multi-domain curriculum process. So when I speak to grounding in theory and support from research, that is a breadth of research based on a comprehensive multi-domain perspective. Evaluation results, that ultimately is to assess the curriculum's positive effect on child outcomes, in particular on key learning and development outcomes through validated studies, not only in production phase of beta testing your curriculum, but hopefully in post-implementation as well. So the more you can demonstrate through your evidence in your rubric, the evaluation, the better outcome you will have in that aspect of the rubric. Professional development. That area of the curriculum rubric is where you would include evidence of how you support significant and high quality professional development for staff implementing your curriculum. How do you as a company support implementation of your curriculum for teaching teams, for coaches, and for administrators? Next is developmental appropriateness. This area of the rubric speaks to multiple subdomains of development, and each of these tie to the early childhood standards of quality. This criterion assesses the degree to which child assessment, the curriculum content, and the promotion, in particular, of family and school partnerships are developmentally appropriate and in alignment with the standards. And finally, the alignment with state standards. I spoke too soon earlier, sorry about that. Alignment with the state standards is where the domain-specific content pieces align with the standards. This is where you speak to math, literacy, social studies, history, those approaches to learning. In particular, one of the specific requirements is around literacy in Michigan's revised process. You will see here that you will need to speak to not only how your curriculum aligns with the Early Childhood Standards of Quality Pre-K adopted by the State Board, but you'll also need to speak to how your curriculum content aligns with the General Education Leadership Network's Essential Instructional Practices in Early Literacy Pre-K. This is a essentials document through the Michigan Association of Intermediate School Districts, GELN network, that has been in partnership developed with the department and many of the Michigan Education Alliance groups. And so this is an agreed upon framework on literacy for Michigan. And so we are now requiring that any curriculum adopted for GSRP must, in the area of literacy, support the GELN Essential Instructional Practices in Early Literacy. So you not only need to speak to the standards of quality, but more specifically also to the GELN Essential Instructional Practices in Early Literacy Pre-K. I'm just stressing this because this is a new aspect of the approval process, and I wanted to make that extremely clear. So just wanted to give you a screenshot of the first section of the evaluation rubric and what it will look like. So there will be instructions for each section of the 5. This one being valid research. You will see the main indicator being the curriculum model is grounded in a theoretical framework. And then you'll see the indicator, which in this case, it says the curriculum model is based on theory and a knowledge base that reflects a philosophical orientation. There is a 7-point continuum for that you will be that your materials and your curriculum will be assessed on. And the members of the Curriculum Review Committee will utilize this scale, and also based on what they review in your actual materials, as well as what you write in that right column. So you are to actually, in narrative, explain how your curriculum meets that indicator and identify within your materials where you have evidence to support your claims in narrative. Based on that, the members of the Curriculum Review Committee will then not only read your response, but then reference back to the materials for verification. And then based on that, they will assign a points based on the verification and their assessment from their professional point of view. So this is how the rubric process will be utilized by the CRC. And Ben will go into a little bit more detail about the CRC and the review process.
Great, thanks, Richard. So now that we've heard a little bit more about what the rubric looks like and how the scoring system works, we'll continue on in our walkthrough of what the CRC will be doing as it reviews curricula. So each proposal will be assigned to 3 members of the CRC who will independently evaluate and score it based on its ability to meet or exceed the criteria, just as Richard described. An average score is then calculated across those reviewers, and a recommendation is made to the full CRC. If there is a disagreement on scoring between the original 3 reviewers that will lead to a curriculum being approved or denied, those issues will be brought to the full CRC for consideration. So the standards for approval are as follows. So for a curriculum to be fully approved for statewide use, it must receive the following scores. It will need to get a 5, or again, remember this is a 7-point scale. It will need to receive a 5 or higher in each of the 5 major overall areas. So those were the ones that Richard described earlier: valid research, evaluation results, professional development, developmental appropriateness, and alignment with state standards. It will also need to receive a 5 or higher in all criteria related to the alignment with the state standards that Richard mentioned. So you need a 5 or higher in the major overall areas, but then in addition to that, inside the state standards section, you need to receive a 5 or higher on everything related to the early childhood quality ratings. You will also need to receive a 3 or higher in all of the non-state standards criteria inside those major areas. Again, there's a curriculum approval process document that walks through these in additional detail if you'd like to learn more information about that. So that is the threshold for statewide approval. For a curriculum to be approved for a pilot, meaning not statewide approval, but for piloted use, it must meet all requirements that were just described in the statewide approval for valid research, professional development, developmental appropriateness, and statewide or in state standards categories. It needs to meet all the same requirements that the statewide approval required. But it can receive a scoring of 3 or below in evaluation results. And that is designed to allow for curricula that may be emerging in the field, is well tied to valid research, and has strong elements of developmental appropriateness and meets all of the state standards, but lacks the evaluation results to meet the threshold for statewide approval, and to give those curricula an opportunity to show that. So that leads us to the decisions that the CRC can make, and there are 3 of those decisions. First, they can decide that a curriculum meets the standards for statewide approval. They can also determine that while it doesn't meet the standard for statewide use, it can be piloted and receive pilot approval. Vendors whose proposals are approved for those pilots will also receive additional requirements for MDE to make sure that they continue to meet high standards and eventually can be considered for statewide approval. And the final decision that the CRC can reach is that a curriculum has been denied because it does not meet the standards for statewide or pilot approval. Vendors, after receiving this decision, can appeal, which Richard will cover in the next section. But vendors can also resubmit curricula for consideration in the next review cycle with documentation that the program has changed or been updated to address some of the gaps that held it back from receiving approval during this cycle. So after the CRC makes its decisions, the department will share the decision and consensus scoring rubrics with the vendors via email. With that, I'm going to transition things back to Richard so that he can provide a little bit more detail on the appeals process.
Okay, so the Department of Education has an appeals process, and that appeals process has been used to inform this appeals process for the Curriculum Review Committee. So because MD is committed to identifying the highest quality aligned curricula for use in GSRP classrooms, if a vendor feels the CRC's decision did not accurately reflect their materials submitted originally, a vendor may submit an appeal to the CRC. That is step 1, is actually to submit an intent to submit an appeal within 7 days of the decision notification. So when the department sends the decision letter to the vendor has 7 days to submit an intent to appeal if their curriculum has been denied. at that point in time, we move on to step 2. That gives, at that point, step 2 is within 30 days, so of the decision notification. This is not 30 additional days. This is 30 calendar days of the decision notification. So just to emphasize, to be consistent with Department Appeals protocol, you have within 7 days of the decision notification letter, intent to submit an appeal. Within 30 days of the decision notification letter, the vendor must submit a second letter that includes the actual following elements of their appeal: the criteria and sub-criteria the vendor believes were not scored correctly. Specifically, the documentation in their original proposal that substantiates their claim. Important, no new information may be submitted for an appeal. So that means you can only reference the information originally submitted that you believe was not accurately assessed, or you feel was overlooked, or may have been missed. If it did not exist in the original submission, you cannot add it at this point. That is when, as Ben mentioned in the previous slide, you can resubmit in the next cycle. So the appeals process is not to make your application submission whole. It is to correct a mistake during the process, potentially. So, third, a description of how the change in scoring could result in the curriculum reaching the threshold for approval. This particular piece in your appeal letter, truly in terms of the points, you need to indicate from a points perspective, you need to indicate that this change in scoring could actually result in an approval. If it's just to correct a misunderstanding and it gives you a few extra points, but not enough to actually move you into a position of a full approval or a piloted approval, then the appeal will not be considered. So these 3 pieces must be included in the appeal letter that is sent within 30 days of the decision notification. You are asked to submit these to me, Richard Lauer, at my email address, lowerr@michigan.gov. At that point, I will convey your appeal to the CRC members. Next slide here. So MD will review each appeal request to determine eligibility based on those 3 pieces that I indicated from the appeal letter. CRC members will then review the disputed section or sections and develop a revised consensus score, if appropriate. A revised decision will be shared with MDE, who will then communicate that with the vendor. After an appeal, the CRC's decision is final. Curriculum may be resubmitted again for consideration in the next review cycle, along with documentation that the program has been changed or updated to address the previously identified gaps. So that is, again, to reinforce that there is every 2 years an opportunity, if you are not satisfied with the outcome of the CRC's decision, you have an opportunity every 2 years to submit your curriculum and continue to make your case for the approval. So, at the final step in this process, as indicated early on in the webinar, is that MDE, once all of this is done in midwinter, will post a final list of approved curricula on or before April 1st. The point of this is so that providers who will already have been aware of a preliminary list posted earlier than April 1st have been engaging in brainstorming and contemplating decisions around curricula for the following program year. But on or before April 1st gives program providers enough time for decision making locally so that there is enough implementation time for any switchover of a curriculum if that is a locally decided action that they choose to make. It is important to understand that all GSRP providers must use a curriculum from the approved list that is posted on our website. The approved list will be posted in two places. One place will be in the curriculum approval process portion of the website that will be maintained year-round. The other place will be within the GSRP implementation manual under the curriculum section, which is the most detailed area for GSRP providers to understand the expectations of the department and the program staff at the department for curriculum implementation. The curriculum approval process overall will be reviewed and updated as needed moving forward into future years. With that, I will turn it back over to Ben as we begin to conclude this webinar.
Great. Thanks, Richard. So that wraps up our presentation of the GSRP curriculum approval process. And now I'd really like to see if anyone has any questions for Richard. Please go ahead and submit them in via the chat function of the webinar. And if you haven't had a chance to submit that question already, please take that opportunity to do that now. And so I will review any questions that we've had sent in. All right, so I have one question here about if you're interested in finding out more information about this overall curriculum approval process, where should folks turn?
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, if you go to www.michigan.gov/GSRP, the curriculum review approval process, full documentation of the entire process and related documents is posted on that web page. It is the second grouping of documents on that page after resources for parents. That's intentional. And so you will remember on slide 14, it's listed as important documents. There is a hyperlink to those documents with a description of those background documents and the forms you need to submit.
Great. All right. It doesn't look like we have any additional questions at this time.
So on this last slide, I also want to provide you a second resource for contact, which is the GSRP program manager, Pat Sargent. So on the slide, you've had me as director at the department and my email for contact. I wanted you to provide a secondary contact at the department so that you have full access in case you need a secondary contact, and that would be Pat Sargent, GSRP Program Manager. You have her email here as well. We want to ensure that there is more than one communication point of contact so that you have any questions regarding this process, we can respond to you in a timely manner. Our goal is to respond to any question within 24 hours via email. And so please understand that that is our goal related to any email you send to us regarding this process. So if you send it individually or to both of us, we will do our best to abide by that timeline.
Great. So I just want to close by saying thank you to everyone who was on the webinar this afternoon. As I mentioned, this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the MDE GSRP website. And so thank you all very much. Please feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.